Sharon Osbourne, the uncompromising judge of the X Factor, the unforgettable soul of the Osbournes, the unwavering force behind a household of chaos and fame, once seemed unshatterable. She wasn't just a voice on television. She was the iron strategist behind a rock legend, the unbending spine of heavy metal's wildest icon, and the relentless firekeeper who stood beside Ozzy Osbourne through every dark night of addiction, betrayal, collapse, and resurrection. For decades, she fought battles most wouldn't survive: cancer, scandals, deep personal heartbreak. And when Ozzy passed away, the world believed the cruelest blow had been delivered. It was supposed to be the end of her suffering. But instead, at 72, another storm gathered, darker, deeper, and more personal than anything she had faced before. It was as if fate had decided that even now, she hadn't endured enough. Before Sharon became a household name, her story began not with comfort or lullabies, but with slammed doors, shouted commands, and the quiet devastation of abandonment. Born in London in 1952 as Sharon Rachel Arden, she entered a world where power shouted louder than love. Her father, Don Arden, was a legendary music mogul, feared in business circles, respected by artists, but cold and distant within the walls of his own home. That home was more a fortress than a sanctuary, ruled not with affection but with control. Contracts and conflict echoed louder than lullabies. There was no room for vulnerability, only iron discipline. Behind those polished wooden doors, there were no bedtime stories, no gentle embraces. Only the clink of glasses at business dinners and the ticking of clocks marking deals sealed in smoke-filled rooms. Her father's empire was built on ambition and ruthlessness, and the cost of that empire was tenderness. For Sharon, love was always conditional. Kindness was earned, or more accurately, denied. Yet, it wasn't her father's dominance that delivered the most profound wound of her childhood. That came from fate itself. At just 6 years old, Sharon's mother was killed in a tragic car accident. One day, there were fights and flashes of comfort. The next, there was only silence. That silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the presence of grief, dense, cold, and permanent. From that moment on, Sharon learned a brutal truth. Nothing soft survives for long. Her home had everything: influence, money, legacy, but almost none of what a young girl truly needs: stability, emotional security, and the space to be afraid. With her mother gone and her father increasingly consumed by the brutal machinery of fame, Sharon was forced to shed innocence like old skin. In that vacuum of love, she developed armor. She watched rising stars and predatory agents parade through her father's office. She saw contracts exchanged like weapons and realized early that in the world of fame, emotion was a liability. "You had to be tough before you learned how to laugh," she would later say, a haunting reflection of a childhood stripped bare of joy. Where others had toys, she had ledgers. Where others played dress-up, she played politics. By the late 1960s, during what should have been the vibrant years of discovery, Sharon was instead cloaked in solitude. Teenage girls around her found friendship, love, and laughter. Sharon studied power. She watched how rooms shifted when her father walked in, and how quickly fortunes could turn. She knew by heart the cost of defiance, not because someone told her, but because she had lived the punishment. Every decision she made was haunted by the threat of his disapproval, every dream tainted by his legacy. Their relationship fractured more with each passing year. As Sharon approached adulthood, father and daughter became adversaries. There were arguments so venomous they became walls of silence. Years passed without a word between them. But amid that emotional wilderness, something powerful took root. Sharon wasn't crushed by her environment. She adapted to it. She didn't simply survive the trauma. She used it as fuel. That cold upbringing, the devastating loss, the emotional starvation, they all became the steel from which her future self was forged. She didn't fall apart. She calcified. And years later, she would reflect with painful clarity. The wounds never fully healed. They weren't meant to. They were reminders. Not gifts, but scars. Markers of the resilience that would one day define her life. Sharon's youth wasn't filled with brightness or color. It was shaped in the shadows, painted with absence, and hardened through grief. But from that darkness emerged someone extraordinary. Not a broken girl, but a survivor. a young woman forged in cruelty who would one day carry not only her own burdens, but also those of a man the world had given up on and never once let them collapse. By the end of the 1970s, at just 27 years old, Sharon Osbourne stood at a critical crossroads. Her past had taught her the language of control, the rules of fame, and the brutal art of endurance. She had seen behind the velvet curtain of the industry and understood that success came with a price. But she had also learned to set her own terms. The very discipline that once suffocated her had now shaped her into a formidable woman, sharp in business, clear in morals, and absolutely unafraid of confrontation. Then came the man who would define not just her career, but the very trajectory of her life, John Michael Ozzy Osbourne. He was 31, recently ejected from Black Sabbath, drowning in addiction, spiraling with self-destruction, and widely considered washed up. To the public, he was a fallen icon. To Sharon, he was a reflection of something deeper, a wounded giant, shaking and unmoored, but not yet extinguished. Their meeting was not scripted. It was electric, and it ignited a firestorm that would forever alter Sharon's life. She saw in Ozzy what no one else dared to, a man not broken, but abandoned. And in that recognition, she made a choice, one that would cost her nearly everything. Choosing to stand beside Ozzy as both manager and partner wasn't just a business decision. It was an act of rebellion, and one that set fire to what was left of her relationship with her father. Their conflict was volcanic. Don Arden saw her decision not just as misguided, but as betrayal, a rejection of the dynasty he had built. Sharon saw it differently. For the first time in her life, she was choosing love over legacy, passion over power. Choosing Ozzy meant losing my family, she later confessed, her voice heavy with sorrow. It was a decision that severed her from her inheritance, stripped her of her role in her father's empire, and cast her into exile from the only world she had ever known. But Sharon did not hesitate. She bet her entire future on a man the world called finished, and once she chose, she never looked back. Managing Ozzy Osbourne in the early years of their partnership wasn't a job. It was an act of war against failure, addiction, ridicule, and poverty. Sharon had bet everything, her future, her family, her name, on a man the world had already written off. And the battlefield was chaos. His name was tarnished, the industry avoided him like a curse, and the drugs were not just present, they were everywhere. There was no safety net, no backup plan. Sharon was walking a high wire stretched over ruin. There were no guarantees, only unpaid bills stacked like monuments to a dream. Nights alone in cheap hotel rooms, phone calls ignored by record labels, and the constant dread that Ozzy might not survive the week. There were no headlines about this phase, no cheers, no television cameras, only the quiet, slow grind of two people trying to pull something back from the edge. I felt like the whole world turned its back, and I was betting my soul on one man, Sharon once said. And she meant every word. Every sleepless night, every frantic attempt to keep Ozzy focused, every hour spent planning tours that might never happen. It was all a prayer dressed as strategy. Ozzy himself would later recall those years in a voice trembling with memory. She saved my life when nobody else would even look me in the eye. It wasn't hyperbole. It was confession. There were mornings when he could barely stand. Nights when he lay in a haze of substances, his eyes glassy, his body cold. And through it all, Sharon stayed, holding him upright when he had no strength left to stand on his own. The pressure was unbearable. Critics called her ruthless. Industry executives dismissed her as delusional. And still, she persisted. Not because she was certain of success, but because she couldn't bear to let him fall. "If this fails, I lose everything," she whispered during those years. And the truth was, she had already lost almost everything but him. What the world would later praise as a comeback had its origins in despair. Sharon became far more than a manager. She became a fortress. She rebuilt his touring presence, negotiated album deals when no one would return her calls, and carefully constructed a public image that the world could believe in again. She wasn't managing a musician. She was resurrecting a myth. Their 1982 wedding wasn't a celebration. It was a contract written in pain. When they stood together and said, "I do," it was more than a vow. It was a line drawn in blood between the wreckage of their past and the uncertain future ahead. Sharon had crossed every imaginable line. from heiress to exile, from daughter to rebel, from strategist to savior. And she would pay the price for that choice every single day. Being Ozzy's wife was not just an emotional commitment. It was physical labor, emotional sacrifice, and a test of spiritual endurance. At just 30 years old, Sharon was raising not just a family, but a legend, often at the same time. She soothed infants in the middle of the night and drafted contracts at dawn. She stood in the shadows of concert stages while hiding the truth. That backstage, Ozzy was unraveling, and she was holding the seams together by force of will. The 1980s were a turning point. Ozzy was supposed to vanish into rock history, another casualty of fame. But Sharon refused to let the world dictate his legacy. She used every ounce of her intelligence, every drop of her grit to bring him back, not just to life, but to dominance. Blizzard of Oz, Diary of a Madman, Bark at the Moon. Each album wasn't just a musical triumph. It was a personal testimony to survival, to defiance, to Sharon's unseen hand behind every beat. Ozzy's return wasn't an accident. It was Sharon's war plan executed with surgical precision. The Prince of Darkness became a brand, a persona, a spectacle, all carefully sculpted in boardroom battles and negotiated against impossible odds. Sharon took every humiliation, every rejection, and turned it into fuel. She didn't just find him stages. She built them. She created an empire where none had existed. And every time the spotlight returned to Ozzy, it cast a faint glow on her, though most never realized she was the one holding up the entire show. But success came with a brutal cost. Behind the glittering concerts and roaring crowds were nights of horror, drug overdoses, emergency room visits, canceled shows, hidden ambulances. Sharon was always one step ahead of collapse. People saw fire and lights. Sharon saw syringes, therapy schedules, and invoices. Ozzy would sometimes emerge from stage drenched in sweat, his hands shaking, and whisper, "Don't let them see me like this." And Sharon, holding it together for cameras and crowds, would steady him, all while silently falling apart herself. Even her greatest achievements carried invisible scars. When she launched Ozfest in 1996, it became an institution, a celebration of metal music, a platform for new talent, and a revival of Ozzy's influence. The world called her ruthless, brilliant, a mastermind. But the truth was quieter and far sadder. Every contract she negotiated, every band she elevated, came at the cost of her marriage, her body, and her sleep. She carried the heavy weight of a genre on her back, all while trying to keep her own family from imploding. Sharon was called controlling, cold, manipulative, but that wasn't the truth. The truth was, she was a woman at war, holding up an empire with nothing but raw determination and unrelenting love. And even then, even with all that strength, there were nights she broke. Nights when Ozzy collapsed in her arms, unresponsive. When she would sit on the floor beside him, whispering prayers she no longer believed in. Nights when she locked herself in a hotel bathroom and sobbed into her fist so her children wouldn't hear. Nights when the sound of 20,000 fans chanting outside felt like cruelty, because inside, her world was crumbling. But even as the walls shook, she stood firm. She canceled shows, rescheduled tours, walked into business meetings with a mask of confidence while her insides bled with worry. In the words of one bandmate, she was the spine of the machine. She rarely received credit, but she didn't need it. She knew the truth. Every night Ozzy made it to the stage was a win. Every breath he took that wasn't laced with poison was a victory. By the late 1990s, Ozzy Osbourne wasn't just still standing. He was larger than life. And beside him, though often hidden in shadow, was the woman who had made it possible. Sharon had carried 3 children, a broken husband, and the entire weight of heavy metal's revival, all without letting it collapse. Their story was never a fairy tale. It was a war journal, and Sharon didn't just survive it. She commanded it. But just as she stabilized the music world, another battlefield was calling, one she never expected. In her 50s, Sharon would step from behind the curtain and into a new spotlight, the world of television, where chaos wasn't hidden but televised. And once again, Sharon would find herself fighting to keep her family, her identity, and her truth from being devoured by a new kind of fame. By the dawn of the 2000s, Sharon Osbourne had already built an empire in the shadows. She had managed the unimaginable, rebuilt a rock icon from rubble, raised 3 children amid endless chaos, and survived every storm the music industry hurled her way. But just when life seemed like it might finally slow down, fate opened a new chapter, one even she couldn't have predicted. A chapter where her life, once fiercely private behind boardroom doors and backstage curtains, would be broadcast into living rooms around the globe. It began with a seemingly simple idea: The Osbournes, a quirky reality television show that would offer audiences a glimpse into the daily, chaotic life of the so-called Prince of Darkness and his family. The concept was meant to be lighthearted, maybe even a bit absurd. But what happened next was a cultural explosion. From 2002 to 2005, The Osbournes wasn't just a show. It was a phenomenon. Sharon Osbourne, once the woman behind the scenes, suddenly became the name on everyone's lips. She wasn't just Ozzy's wife anymore. She was Sharon, the sharp-tongued, quick-witted matriarch of madness, capable of delivering biting commentary one moment and unrelenting maternal love the next. America didn't just watch her. America embraced her. And yet, as with everything in Sharon's life, this newfound fame came with a price. For audiences, The Osbournes was hilarious, outrageous, and addictively unpredictable. But for Sharon, it was something far more complicated. The same cameras that catapulted her into celebrity also stripped away the final layers of privacy her family had left. Moments that once would have stayed behind closed doors, arguments, breakdowns, vulnerable conversations, became content, ratings, memes. The world laughed. But inside the Osbourne household, the toll was mounting. Television gave us a microphone, Sharon would later say, but it took away our quiet nights. She wasn't being dramatic. She was being honest. The cost of constant exposure is erosion, of boundaries, of identity, of the small, sacred spaces a family needs to survive. When the cameras stopped rolling, the echoes lingered. The arguments that became punchlines had been real. The hurt wasn't fictional. Ozzy, years later, called those reality TV years miserable, and Sharon admitted it nearly cost them everything. Yet her authenticity, that fiery candor that refused to pretend, only made her more magnetic. The entertainment world took notice. Talent shows came calling. Producers saw in Sharon not just a character, but a force. Soon, she was sitting behind the judge's desk on the X Factor UK, America's Got Talent, and later The Talk. On each show, she wasn't a copy of anyone else. She was unmistakably herself, raw, honest, hilarious, and occasionally terrifying. Contestants feared her scowls and lived for her rare, radiant praise. Her critiques were sharp, but her empathy was never fake. She could call a performance dreadful with a curled lip, then moments later speak about survival with a tenderness that stopped viewers in their tracks. Sharon didn't perform. She existed, and that made her a rarity in a world of glitter and illusion. She authored a best-selling memoir that pulled no punches. She opened up about her childhood pain, her battles with cancer, her complicated marriage, and her emotional scars. With every page, she carved out a new identity, not just the woman beside the rock legend, but a star in her own right. She was no longer just the flamekeeper. She was the flame. But television, for all its adoration, is a fickle throne. What it crowns one day, it can crucify the next. In 2010, Sharon found a new home on The Talk, a daytime show that allowed her to show a more introspective, grounded side. For over a decade, she thrived, offering perspective, laughter, and sharp debate. But in 2021, during a heated live discussion, a single moment ignited a firestorm. A misunderstanding, a disagreement, a flash of emotion, it was all it took. Almost overnight, the tide turned. Sharon went from beloved truth-teller to vilified antagonist. Accusations poured in. Social media turned vicious. Networks distanced themselves. Contracts disappeared. Headlines dissected her every word, often without context. And the internet, ruthless as ever, demanded a reckoning. "I thought my life was over," Sharon admitted in a trembling voice during an interview. For a woman who had stared down cancer, addiction, betrayal, and loss, this cancellation hit differently. This wasn't just a personal scandal. It was public character assassination. What made it harder was the isolation. Sharon, who had stood toe-to-toe with executives, managers, and monsters, now faced an invisible enemy. Millions of strangers with opinions, anger, and keyboards. She was accused, judged, and condemned in comment sections and viral posts. Her strength was mistaken for cruelty. Her silence for guilt. But beneath the media circus was a woman breaking, quietly, painfully. She scrolled through headlines late at night, reading words that cast her as a villain. She sat in empty rooms, her phone silent, her inbox a battlefield of broken relationships. And still, she endured. She did what Sharon Osbourne had always done. She refused to surrender. She walked away from the talk with her head held high. Not because she felt victorious, but because she knew she had to protect her peace. She gave interviews. She spoke with vulnerability. She didn't try to rewrite history or beg for forgiveness. She simply told the truth. You either live in shame, or you live in truth, she said. I chose truth. Those words weren't defiant. They were tired. They were weathered. But they were resolute. Sharon wasn't looking to reclaim her throne. She was rebuilding her self-worth. By the time the credits rolled on her years in television, Sharon Osbourne was no longer just a manager, a wife, or a judge. She was something far rarer, a woman who had lived through every permutation of public life and refused to become its prisoner. She had stood in the brightest spotlight and survived its most cruel and unforgiving glare. She didn't emerge unscathed. She emerged scorched, scarred, but still standing. Yet even as the world scrutinized her words and questioned her intent, another battle was quietly unfolding. A battle not against fame or reputation or scandal, but against her own body. And in that private war, Sharon would discover the limits of her endurance all over again. Amid all the spotlight and public scrutiny, Sharon Osbourne faced a quieter, far more brutal war. One that would not play out on talk shows or in interviews, but in hospital corridors, on sterile bathroom floors, and in the aching silence of early morning fear. In 2002, at just 50 years old, she received the diagnosis that shatters even the strongest spirits: colon cancer. Those words, cold, clinical, merciless, did not just mark the beginning of a medical journey. For Sharon, they reopened a childhood wound that had never truly healed. The memory of her mother's sudden death when she was only 6, a loss that had shaped the rest of her life, came roaring back with punishing clarity. Chemotherapy is not just treatment. It is erosion. It stripped Sharon of her energy, drained the color from her skin, and left her too weak to climb stairs without pausing for breath. Her voice trembled. Her hands shook. Her hair fell away in fragile clumps, like whispers of strength she could no longer hold on to. In the mirror, she barely recognized herself. But the pain wasn't only physical. It was psychological, existential. Sharon didn't fear pain. She had endured it her entire life. What she feared, more than anything, was leaving her children motherless, just as she had been left. And so, as her body weakened, her resolve hardened. She would not let history repeat itself. She would not allow her own children to grow up in the shadow of an absence. That singular vow, whispered in the darkness when the pain made her gasp for air, became her anchor. To the public, Sharon remained radiant. Her sharp wit and biting sense of humor never faltered on camera. Viewers saw her cracking jokes, scolding with flair, laughing with guests, delivering the performance of strength. But they didn't see what came before and after the cameras rolled. They didn't see her hunched over a sink moments before a live segment, trembling as she wiped away tears. They didn't see the pills lined up like soldiers on her nightstand, or the bathroom floor where she sometimes curled in exhaustion, praying for the strength to stand. Her children never saw her cry, not because she wasn't breaking, but because she refused to let them feel fear. That was the burden she chose to carry alone. Even her husband, the man she had saved time and again, couldn't fully comprehend the depth of her struggle. Ozzy, battling his own demons, stood beside her as best he could, but it was Sharon who carried them both through those nights. To everyone else, she was iron, untouchable. But in truth, Sharon was enduring the slow disintegration of her body while holding up the world around her. And then, in December 2003, just as the worst of her treatment was peaking, the unthinkable happened. Ozzy, the man she had spent decades keeping alive, was nearly taken from her in an instant. A near-fatal ATV accident shattered his collarbone, broke several ribs, and left his body bruised and bleeding. Machines kept his lungs moving. His survival was uncertain. Sharon, still hooked up to 4 lines herself, her veins burning from chemo, dragged her weakening body through the cold corridors of the hospital. She refused to be pushed in a wheelchair. She refused to let her illness stop her from being at his side. Pale, exhausted, her steps unsteady, she planted herself in a chair beside him and did not move. Her trembling hand held his. Her whisper was barely audible. "You're not leaving me. Not now." Ozzy later recalled. "Through tears, she saved me when she could barely save herself." But Sharon's trials didn't end there. While one hand gripped her husband's, the other reached desperately for her children, both of whom were spiraling. Jack, still barely more than a teenager, was slipping into addiction. Sharon would sit up at 3 a.m., holding the phone and shaking hands, begging strangers at treatment centers to take her son. Her voice cracked. Her body ached. But her desperation was a force beyond logic. "Please take him before it's too late," she whispered into the darkness. Jack would later admit, "I thought I was losing myself while my mom was fighting for her life." He wasn't exaggerating. And then came Kelly, vibrant, wild, magnetic Kelly, whose laughter began to vanish under the weight of pills and alcohol. Sharon, too weak to raise her voice, now carried her daughter's deterioration like an invisible weight pressing against her chest. "Cancer was killing me slowly," she would later say, "but addiction was killing my family faster." The irony was cruel. To the outside world, the Osbournes were hilarious chaos. Audiences laughed at Ozzy's mumbling, at Jack's sarcasm, at Kelly's eye rolls, at Sharon's fiery scolding. But the cameras didn't show the real story. They didn't show the mother who had no hair, whose body was bloated from steroids, vomiting silently between takes. They didn't show the wife who sat for 12 hours at her husband's hospital bedside, too weak to walk, but unwilling to leave. They didn't show the woman who clutched a phone in the dark, begging someone, anyone, to save her children while her own life was slipping away. What the world saw as entertainment, Sharon was living as apocalypse. Still, she refused to fall apart. She canceled what needed canceling. She rescheduled what could wait. She showed up when the lights came on, smiled through pain, barked orders when necessary, and kept her family upright through sheer force of will. One bandmate would later call her the spine of the whole damn operation. And he wasn't wrong. She was a soldier on 3 fronts, battling disease inside her veins, fighting to keep her husband alive, and wrestling her children back from the edge. No one could have blamed her if she had collapsed. But Sharon didn't know how to quit. Every scar on her body, every night of silent tears, every whispered mantra of "not now" became part of a new identity, not one made of fame or fortune, but of ferocity. Ozzy would later say, "She held me together when I was falling apart." Jack, years into recovery, would confess, "She fought for me when I didn't even want to be saved." Kelly, voice trembling, would recall, "I thought I lost her. But she never stopped being there, even when she was broken." These weren't fan tributes. They were survival testaments. Proof that behind every addict who found recovery, behind every rock star who found his roar again, was a woman too stubborn to let any of them go. And so, when the world remembers Sharon Osbourne, it must go beyond the fiery judge, the rock manager, the fierce wife. It must see the woman who waged war on 3 fronts and never once surrendered. Scarred, pale, exhausted, she stood. And in that standing, she became something rarer than a legend. She became the last line of defense for a family that might otherwise have vanished in the storm. By 2012, Sharon Osbourne had already survived more than most ever would. Cancer had carved through her body and left behind a battlefield of wounds. Ozzy's near-death experience had burned scars into her soul. Her children's addictions had nearly broken her heart. And yet, after all the suffering, another truth arrived with cruel precision. At age 60, doctors looked at her genetic history, the shadow that had stolen her mother, the same ghost that had tried to claim her once already, and told her the words she feared most. Cancer could return. And next time, it might not be survivable. There was no tumor, no visible enemy, just a possibility, a silent threat. But Sharon knew better than to wait for pain before acting. She had seen how fast life could vanish, how quickly love could collapse under the weight of an unchecked illness. And so, with stunning clarity, she made a decision that few would dare to face. She would undergo a preventive double mastectomy. It wasn't about beauty. It was about time, about life, about legacy. I didn't do it to look different, she said, her voice clear, unwavering. I did it to stay alive. The operation was brutal. The healing process, agonizing. And when Sharon looked down and saw the scars etched across her chest, they weren't just medical. They were emotional. They were symbols of a choice that few would ever fully understand. Flesh had been traded for future, vanity for survival. And in that trade, Sharon carried more than stitches. She carried the memory of being a 6-year-old girl without a mother. I couldn't leave them motherless, she whispered years later. Not like I was. Her greatest fear wasn't pain. It was absence. It was knowing what it felt like to wake up and never hear your mother's voice again. She couldn't let her own children feel that same kind of silence. That is what broke her. Not the incisions, not the soreness, but the idea that history could repeat itself. In a world obsessed with image, perfection, and youth, Sharon did the unthinkable. She stood in front of cameras and told the truth. She didn't hide the surgery. She didn't soften the words. She spoke about it publicly, boldly, with brutal honesty. Scars are not shame, she declared. They're proof that you survived. And in doing so, she gave millions of women permission to stop hiding, to embrace survival, to speak aloud the fears they had buried. She became a mirror for every woman who had stared at herself in the mirror after surgery and wondered if she was still whole. Sharon didn't just endure. She transformed her pain into testimony. But survival, as she would later admit, is rarely clean. Not every decision she made with her body came from clarity. Some were guided by pressure, by insecurity, by the haunting desire to look like the image the world demanded. There were cosmetic procedures, injections, surgeries that she would later regret. She once looked in the mirror and didn't see herself at all, just a version of a stranger staring back. I felt frozen, she admitted. Not metaphorically, but literally. Her once expressive face, altered by procedures that promised youth, left her feeling stuck, unable to recognize the woman who had fought so fiercely. And then came the weight loss. A brutal, rapid shedding of pounds driven by medication, leaving her frame smaller, her presence diminished. The tabloids didn't offer empathy. They turned her suffering into spectacle. Her face, her weight, her scars, all became gossip fodder, dissected as though pain were public property. What others would have hidden, Sharon exposed. She admitted her mistakes. She acknowledged the choices that betrayed her. And then, as she had always done, she rebuilt, not her face, but her identity. Her candor wasn't for shock value. It was her way of taking back power, of reclaiming the narrative, of refusing to let shame decide who she was. She didn't want to be seen as flawless. She wanted to be seen as honest. And even amid the cruelty of public scrutiny, Sharon endured. Because from childhood, she had known that love could vanish, that beauty was fleeting, and that resilience was the only crown worth wearing. Ozzy, watching her navigate the storm of media and regret, once said, "She saved me, but she also saved herself." For Jack, she was still the mother who had fought for his life while her own body fell apart. For Kelly, she was proof that love didn't leave, even when everything else did. And for Sharon herself, the woman she saw in the mirror wasn't perfect, but she was strong, scarred, surviving. The scars across her chest, the fine lines on her face, the strain in her voice, they weren't signs of failure. They were medals of endurance. They were the living map of a woman who had walked through fire and kept going, again and again. When she stepped back into public life after the mastectomy and the recovery and the humiliation of public judgment, Sharon didn't hide her wounds. She wore them, not as weakness, but as declaration. She had survived betrayal. She had survived illness. She had survived herself. Her beauty, once tied to appearance, had now become something far more rare. The quiet glow of someone who had nothing left to prove, because she had already proven everything. She wasn't the same woman who had once ruled boardrooms or captivated audiences on live television. She was softer now, smaller in stature, quieter in tone. But there was power in her presence still, the power of someone who had seen everything fall apart and chosen to rebuild anyway. The world expected Sharon to disappear, to hide, to cover her scars with silence. But Sharon did what Sharon had always done. She stood up. And by doing so, she didn't just reclaim her life. She gave countless others the courage to reclaim theirs. Her story wasn't about survival in the traditional sense. It was about evolving, about redefining strength, about showing the world that a woman could be powerful and vulnerable, wounded and unyielding, shattered and still whole. The world often tries to reduce women like Sharon to headlines, to scandals, to surgeries, to mistakes. But what it misses is this: she is not a cautionary tale. She is a victory, not in spite of her scars, but because of them. The courage it takes to rise when everything inside you wants to stay down. That's where real strength lives. And in Sharon Osbourne, that strength burns like a torch, still lit, still moving forward, still guiding others through their own darkness. She would continue to endure more betrayals, breakdowns, the long, painful descent of the man she loved. But in that moment, in that chapter, Sharon had rewritten what it meant to survive. Not quietly, not secretly, but boldly. And with every word she spoke, every scar she showed, she reminded the world that survival isn't always graceful, but it is always beautiful. By 2016, Sharon Osbourne had already faced storms that would have destroyed most people. She had survived cancer, rebuilt her husband's legacy from ashes, helped her children recover from addiction, and carried the weight of fame, scandal, and judgment without ever truly buckling. But even the strongest walls can crack when the destruction comes from within. The deepest wound of her life did not come from illness. It came from betrayal. After more than 3 decades of standing beside Ozzy Osbourne through every collapse, every overdose, every scandal, Sharon discovered something that sliced deeper than any diagnosis. Ozzy had been unfaithful. The day she found out, Sharon described the sensation as a blade through the chest. Not metaphorically, physically. A cold, sharp, breath-stealing shock that shattered something at the very core of her being. She had sacrificed her entire world for this man. Her career, her inheritance, her health, her sanity. And now, after everything, the pain had come from the person she had fought hardest to save. For the first time in their decades-long love story, Sharon walked away. The separation was short, but the pain was immense. It wasn't just about infidelity. It was about the unraveling of a narrative she had spent her whole life building. Their love had survived addiction, loss, near death. It had weathered storms that most couples would never imagine. But this felt different. It wasn't chaos inflicted by the outside world. It was a rupture from within. Ozzy later admitted the truth in public. He didn't try to deny it. He confessed. And with that confession came shame. He spoke in interviews with visible remorse, acknowledging that his actions had nearly destroyed the one thing that had always saved him. For Sharon, the aftermath was brutal. She didn't rise up in fire and fury. She fell into depression, into grief, into uncertainty. Days blurred into nights. She couldn't eat. She couldn't sleep. The woman who had stared down cancer and carried empires now confessed that she wasn't sure if she could survive her own heartbreak. And then came the night that nearly ended it all. Ozzy, consumed by illness, addiction, and emotional turmoil, descended into a moment so dark that it would change their lives forever. Sharon would later describe it with a voice that still trembled, her vision narrowing, her heartbeat pounding, the growing certainty that this was it, that she might not live to see another dawn. The air left the room, the world spun, and love, the very force she had relied on for survival, suddenly felt like a threat. Seconds stretched like eternities, until sirens screamed through the silence, and red and blue lights splashed across their walls. Police burst through the door, and what could have ended in irreversible tragedy was, somehow, stopped. That night broke me, Sharon later said, her voice haunted. But even in that shattered moment, she did what only Sharon Osbourne could do. She searched for meaning in the madness. She realized then that survival sometimes means drawing a line, not with hatred, but with truth, with boundaries, with a refusal to allow love to become a prison. That night didn't just test their marriage. It tested Sharon's entire identity. Was she still the woman who could fix everything? Or would she finally choose herself? Ozzy, in rare moments of devastating honesty, admitted he didn't remember the rage, only the horror of what he had done. The shame was real. He confessed that addiction, illness, and emotional collapse had made him into his own worst enemy, and nearly cost him the only person who had ever truly stood by him. For Sharon, it wasn't hatred that followed. It was clarity. She didn't forgive easily. She didn't forget. But she did something harder. She chose to stay. Leaving might have looked like strength, she said, but staying, facing it, that took more courage than I ever thought I had. To the outside world, it seemed impossible. Why stay with someone who had hurt you that deeply? Why stay after betrayal, after danger, after decades of carrying someone else's pain? But Sharon wasn't guided by optics. She was guided by love, and by the belief that healing was still possible. The process was long, grueling, ugly. Therapy sessions that started in silence and ended in tears. Conversations where trust had to be rebuilt word by word, day by day. But they did the work. Together. Slowly, painfully, they began to mend. Ozzy admitted his failures. He sought treatment. And in public interviews, he spoke about Sharon not just with affection, but with reverence. "She's the reason I'm still alive," he said. Their love, once defined by fire and chaos, was now being rebuilt in quiet moments of truth. To outsiders, Sharon's choice may have looked like surrender, but it wasn't. It was defiance, the decision to write her own ending, to insist that even something broken beyond recognition could still be rebuilt, but only if both hearts were willing to do the work. "I didn't forgive because I forgot," she said. "I forgave because I wanted my family to have a future." That distinction matters. It wasn't about erasing pain. It was about creating space for healing. This chapter of Sharon's life didn't look like triumph. It looked like survival. A different kind. The kind that doesn't roar. The kind that sits in silence and chooses to try again. And in doing so, she became something more than strong. She became resilient in a way most will never understand. Her marriage to Ozzy was never a fairy tale. It was a battlefield. And Sharon Osbourne, even with her heart cracked open, proved that the bravest act of all is not always walking away. Sometimes, the bravest thing is to stay, to look at the person who broke you, and to say, "We rebuild, or we end, but we do not pretend." Ozzy listened. He changed. And together, they carved out a new kind of love, one born not of illusions, but of earned grace. Years later, their love would still bear scars, but it would also bear testimony. Testimony to the power of forgiveness, to the strength it takes to face the person who wounded you and still reach for their hand, to the idea that love isn't always clean, but it is always worth fighting for. Sharon's story was no longer just about survival. It was about transformation, about the woman who had endured addiction, cancer, betrayal, and public destruction, and still refused to break. Because sometimes, the most powerful form of strength is choosing to stay. By 2019, the man the world had once feared, worshipped, and immortalized as the Prince of Darkness was a shadow of his former self. One seemingly small accident at home, a simple fall, became a gateway to a storm unlike anything Sharon or Ozzy Osbourne had ever faced. That fall set off a devastating chain reaction of surgeries, complications, and decline that would strip Ozzy of what little strength he had left. The legend who once commanded entire stadiums with a single growl now struggled to cross a room. His body, once fueled by chaos and adrenaline, now betrayed him with every step. Metal rods were inserted where muscle had failed. Painkillers replaced sound checks. The voice that had defined an era was reduced to silence, groans, and shallow breaths. Sharon watched it all unfold from the sidelines, not as a manager, not as a television personality, but as a wife. A woman standing at the edge of a love story that was fading. She memorized the rhythms of hospital machines, became fluent in the language of medications, and learned to hold her breath every time Ozzy's did. "I've lived through betrayal, through addiction, through illness, but nothing prepared me for this," Sharon admitted. "Nothing prepared me for watching the man I love be dismantled piece by piece." And yet, even in this collapse, Ozzy's guilt overwhelmed him more than his physical pain. He whispered to Sharon in the dark, ashamed, "You didn't sign up for this." His once mighty hands, trembling with regret, held hers as if begging forgiveness not for what he had done, but for what he could no longer be. Sharon's reply was simple, fierce, final. "We fight this together, or not at all." The world saw canceled shows, delayed appearances, vague updates from publicists, but they didn't see Sharon lifting her husband into bed as his legs gave out. They didn't see her collapse on a hospital couches, forehead pressed against sterile pillows, whispering prayers that had no words, only desperation. They didn't see Ozzy, once unstoppable, weep as he looked at his shaking hands and whispered, "My body has betrayed me." It wasn't addiction that haunted them now. It was time. It was nature. It was the quiet cruelty of a body that had given everything and now had nothing left. In January 2020, the truth could no longer be hidden. Ozzy Osbourne publicly revealed he had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, a condition that would explain the tremors, the weakness, the pain that refused to let go. The announcement came like a dagger to longtime fans. But for Sharon, it was a release. No more hiding. No more pretending. They sat together, hand in hand, during the press conference. Ozzy's voice cracked. Sharon's eyes, though glassy, never wavered. When he struggled, she steadied. When he fell silent, she spoke. "This is not the end," her expression said, even if her voice didn't. Not yet. What most didn't realize was that the announcement had been planned for months, postponed only because Sharon was waiting for Ozzy to feel strong enough to handle the fallout. Even now, she was shielding him. But fate, as always, was not finished. Just as they began to adjust to the Parkinson's diagnosis, the pandemic swept in like a second curse. Both Sharon and Ozzy were struck by COVID, their already fragile bodies forced into yet another war. This time, it was truly terrifying. Sharon would later confess, "I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid of leaving him alone in the dark." Feverish, weak, gasping, she still dragged herself from her bed to his, just to place her hand on his chest and feel it rise, just to know he was still there. Ozzy, remembering those nights, didn't mention the pain, only the image of Sharon in the doorway, eyes full of fear but hands steady. "If she goes," he whispered, "I go too." That was the depth of their bond. Not a fairy tale, not perfection, but survival woven with devotion. And out of that double storm, Parkinson's and the pandemic, Sharon forged meaning. She refused to let it end in silence. Ozzy deserved a final act. Not in hospital beds, not in sterile rooms, but on stage, in sound, in fire. She began planning something no one else dared speak aloud. One last concert. One final roar. A farewell that would honor everything Ozzy had been and everything they had built together. It wasn't announced as a farewell, but Sharon knew the truth. July 5th, 2025. Birmingham, the city where it had all begun. Sharon planned every detail in silence. Contracts, doctors, contingency plans. She worried his spine would give out under the lights, that his voice would falter, that the moment meant to be triumphant would instead become a tragedy. But Ozzy had begged. He didn't want to fade. He wanted to roar. One last time. So she built him not just a stage, but an altar. When the lights went down, Sharon stood just off stage, her fists clenched, whispering, "Please, just let him finish." She knew what this night meant. Not just for him, for the fans, for herself. Ozzy walked out, frail, trembling, but crowned in fire. And then he sang. The first note tore through the air like a blade. Cracked, raw, but unmistakably Ozzy. The crowd didn't scream just in celebration. They screamed in mourning. They knew. This was the end. Each lyric was a countdown. Each howl was a goodbye. Sharon stood backstage, her hands white-knuckled, tears streaming. Not because it was sad, but because it was sacred. It wasn't a concert, a crew member later said. It was a rite. Ozzy gave everything. Every drop left in him. "This is all I have left to give," he had whispered to Sharon before walking out. And he gave it. The final chord rang like a funeral bell and a coronation all at once. Thunder and silence. And then it was over. Sharon stood hidden in the wings, sobbing. She had carried him through addiction, betrayal, illness, surgeries, and now she had carried him to his final stage. She had given him the ending he deserved. Not in a bed, but in fire. The roar that once shook stadiums had become a whisper. And Sharon knew this was the last time. That night was agony. But it was also grace. Because it was Sharon Osbourne, the woman forged in cruelty, tempered in fire, and defined by unbreakable love, who had given Ozzy Osbourne not just a life, but a final act of dignity. And with that, the legend's voice faded. But hers, her strength, her legacy, her refusal to let him be forgotten, had only begun to speak louder. The farewell concert in Birmingham was not just an event. It was a reckoning, a love letter written in fire. But even that monumental night could not hold back what was coming. In the summer of 2025, just weeks after his final performance, Ozzy Osbourne lay in bed, frail, his once mighty frame hollowed out by time, illness, and pain. The roar that had shaken stadiums had faded to a shallow breath. His voice, once wild and defiant, came in broken fragments. Every word was a struggle, every blink a battle. And by his side, as she had always been, sat Sharon, her hand wrapped around his like a tether to the world. She refused to let go, as if her grip alone could anchor him to life. She didn't speak often during those final nights. She whispered memories, soft words only he could hear, of their children, their wildest triumphs, their hardest nights, of the music, of the moments no one else had witnessed but them. For more than 40 years, they had survived together. But this fight, the one against time itself, was one Sharon couldn't win. Ozzy, often drifting in and out of sleep, would sometimes manage a faint smile. Sometimes he would squeeze her hand with the last strength he had. And when he did, he would whisper something that shattered Sharon each time. "You kept me alive longer than I deserved." To the world, he was still the Prince of Darkness. To Sharon, he was just the man she loved, the man she had saved, the man who had shattered her and held her, betrayed her and loved her, but had always returned to her. Until now. In the early morning hours of July 22nd, 2025, the room fell still. Ozzy's chest rose and fell, more slowly than before. Sharon leaned in, brushing sweat from his brow. She didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she held his hand tighter. "You roared until the end, my love," she whispered, her voice steady even as it cracked. And then his eyes, tired, dim, but still full of love, opened once more. They met hers. And with a final, almost imperceptible breath, he was gone. The silence that followed was louder than any concert. Sharon didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She stayed, sitting beside his body, holding his hand, forehead pressed to his, breathing in the silence that now belonged to her alone. When doctors entered to turn off the machines, Sharon didn't move. "I will carry you," she whispered. That day, Ozzy Osbourne, rock's eternal rebel, chaos incarnate, father, husband, icon, slipped into history. And Sharon Osbourne became the widow of a legend. The funeral was more than a goodbye. It was a reverse coronation. Thousands gathered in black shirts, candles lit, faces turned to the sky. Streets were lined with fans, faces young and old, voices trembling, songs hummed through tears. Inside the church, music echoed like memory. The songs that had once shaken the world now played softly, as though the universe itself had dimmed its lights. Sharon stood in the front row, her hand resting on Ozzy's casket. Jack and Kelly clutched each other behind her. The family, so often in chaos, stood still. And when the chant began, a thunderous "Ozzy, Ozzy, Ozzy," rolling through the air, Sharon's composure broke. She wept openly, not just for the man, but for the years, the memories, the wars they had fought, and the silence he had left her with. "He wanted to leave with noise," she said later. And he did. When the mourners were gone and the church was empty, Sharon remained, sitting alone in the front pew, surrounded by flowers, photographs, the guitar Ozzy had once cherished resting quietly beside the casket. For the first time in decades, there was no show to run, no contract to renegotiate, no voice to guide, just quiet, just absence. Later, she would confess, "That was the loneliest moment of my life." The world lost a legend that day, but Sharon lost her other half. She walked out of the funeral not as a manager, not as a co-star, not even as a public figure, but as the last keeper of their story. Every flame Ozzy had carried in life now belonged to her. The weeks that followed were a blur. Cameras captured Sharon looking elegant, composed, draped in black. But those closest to her saw the tremors in her hands, the distant stare in her eyes, the way she sometimes paused mid-sentence, lost in memory. Nights were the hardest. The side of the bed where Ozzy once slept remained untouched. She admitted, "I wasn't afraid of sickness, but I was never ready for absence." She stayed mostly in their Buckinghamshire home, the one that used to echo with Ozzy's laughter and their children's noise. Jack, Kelly, and Amy visited often. They brought the grandchildren. And for a few hours at a time, the house was full again. On weekends, Sharon kept the family ritual, dinner together. They cooked simple meals, watched old home videos, listened to Ozzy's voice crackling through speakers. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes both. In the garden Ozzy loved, Sharon spent quiet mornings tending to the flowers. Her hand would brush along a rose bush, and she'd whisper, this was his favorite spot. It wasn't for show. No cameras. No press. Just memory. Work hadn't disappeared. She still recorded the family podcast when she had the strength. She still approved projects tied to Ozzy's legacy, an upcoming biopic, archival releases, charity events. But everything moved slower now, at her pace, in rhythms that allowed for grief. Her health showed the toll. Sharon spoke openly about sleep struggles, about the long nights, about waking before dawn just to walk the garden, because the bed felt too big. She changed her diet, focused on greens, proteins. She rebuilt strength not for appearance, but for survival. Therapy became part of her routine, not because she was weak, but because, for the first time in her life, she didn't have anyone left to save. And that, in itself, was a different kind of loneliness. She let go of cosmetic maintenance. Her style became simpler. Her presence, softer. She looked more fragile, but those who saw her said the same thing. She had never looked more real. And even in mourning, Sharon turned pain into purpose. The Osbourne estate, valued at over $200 million, was no longer just a fortune. It became a mission. Portions went to Parkinson's research, children's charities, music education. Every pound earned from Ozzy's final concert in Birmingham had already been funneled, by Sharon's quiet hand, into those same causes. To the world, it had been a concert. But in truth, Sharon had made it a covenant of hope. She rarely attended public events. Only tributes, memorials. And when she spoke, she did so with brevity and precision. Behind every icon, she reminded audiences, was someone who carried the fire when they couldn't. He wanted to leave with noise, she told mourners. Now it's my duty to keep the echo alive. And she has. Since Ozzy's passing in late July 2025, Sharon Osbourne has carried herself with a kind of silence that only those who have endured unimaginable loss can understand. To the world, she remains composed, poised, even graceful. But those closest to her speak of something different, a grief that is raw, unfiltered, and ever-present. Friends whisper that she has grown thinner, that her voice, once sharp as steel, now carries an echo of absence. Her eyes sometimes drift mid-conversation, as if reaching for something that's no longer there. Nights, she says, are the most difficult. The side of the bed where Ozzy once slept remains untouched. His robe still hangs behind the door. His voice still haunts the house in echoes only she can hear. I wasn't afraid of sickness, Sharon said, but I was never ready for silence. For a woman who had survived the most public storms, betrayal, cancer, cancellation, it was absence that finally wounded her deepest. She remains in Buckinghamshire most of the time now, rarely venturing far. The house, once filled with laughter, chaos, and noise, is quieter. Jack, Kelly, and Amy visit often, bringing with them her grandchildren, their joy a balm, their presence a reminder that Ozzy's bloodline still sings. On Sundays, Sharon insists on the family ritual, dinner together, a tradition she keeps not just for herself, but for him. Ozzy's favorite recipes are cooked with reverence. At the head of the table, his chair remains empty, but his memory fills the room. They play old tapes, watch family videos, sometimes laugh through tears. And in those moments, the Osbournes are whole again, if only for a heartbeat. In the mornings, Sharon walks through the garden Ozzy loved. She tends the roses in silence, watering them gently. She speaks to the wind. This was his favorite spot, she says, her hand brushing the leaves. There are no cameras, no interviews, only memory, only love. She still records the Osbournes' podcast occasionally, her voice steadier now, though marked by a tenderness not present before. She oversees legacy projects quietly, documentaries, the biopic, foundation work. But there is no rush. She moves slowly, with intention, with grief. Her body, she admits, feels the weight of loss. Sleep is fragile. Her appetite is inconsistent. Some nights, she walks the halls at 4 a.m., unable to rest. On those nights, she sits in Ozzy's old chair, wraps herself in his old jacket, and simply breathes. Sometimes that is all she can do. She eats clean now, greens, protein, teas. Her doctors encouraged it. But Sharon admits the change wasn't for health alone. I had to find ways to feel strong again, she says. Even when everything inside me feels empty. She has largely stepped back from cosmetic procedures. Her style is quieter now. Simpler. There's less polish. Less performance. But more presence. More truth. The beauty that remains is no longer surface. It radiates from something deeper. Something hard-earned. And even now, even in mourning, Sharon is giving. The Osbourne estate, worth more than $200 million, is no longer simply a monument to rock and roll. Under Sharon's direction, it has become a mission, a legacy with purpose. Significant portions have already been committed to Parkinson's research, a final, defiant stand against the disease that stole so much from Ozzy. Children's charities receive regular donations. Music education programs are funded under Ozzy's name. And the proceeds from Ozzy's last concert, that sacred night in Birmingham, were redirected quietly by Sharon into grants, hospital programs, and musical instruments for children who might never have held one otherwise. To the world, it was a concert. To Sharon, it was a covenant. Her appearances are rare now. She attends select memorials, tribute shows, and when she speaks, it is never long. But her words are heavy. They stay with people. Behind every legend, she once said, there's someone carrying the fire when they can't. And Sharon carried that fire longer than anyone could have imagined. She says little about the future. Her days are measured differently now, not in ratings or ticket sales or headlines, but in memories, in small rituals, in the sound of her grandchildren's laughter, in the quiet rustle of leaves in the garden Ozzy once danced through barefoot with a glass of wine and a smile only she had ever truly understood. She does not call herself a widow. She calls herself a keeper, a bearer of story. And perhaps that's what Sharon Osbourne has always been, not just a manager or a wife or a TV star, but a witness to fame, to pain, to perseverance. Her grief is not performative. It is lived, woven into her routine, into the way she folds laundry, the way she walks through the house, the way she brushes past his old guitar without touching it. Her grief has become part of her, not as a wound, but as a reminder of love that endured, of strength that did not waver, of fire that still burns, even after the music stops. In interviews, when asked how she keeps going, Sharon doesn't offer slogans or rehearsed lines. She simply shrugs, then says softly, "You don't move on. You move with it." It is a kind of wisdom that only comes from the other side of devastation. Sharon has shown the world many things. That scars are not shame. That betrayal does not have to destroy. That love is not perfect, but it can be unbreakable. That survival is not always beautiful, but it is always worth it. And now, in this final chapter, she shows us one last truth. That legacy is not about who gets remembered. It's about why. Ozzy's roar taught us how to defy the darkness. But Sharon's silence, her endurance, her presence, her unshakable devotion, teaches us something greater. It teaches us how to carry the light when the storm won't pass. It teaches us that sometimes the greatest act of love is simply staying. Sharon Osbourne has survived every kind of fire. And when the last one finally flickered out, she didn't vanish. She stood up, not flawless, not unbroken, but unyielding. And in that quiet strength, she reminds us, some legends burn bright. Others keep the flame alive,